You carry it without announcing it, without shaping it into a complaint that might invite response. It is not dramatic enough for attention, not acute enough for alarm. It is simply there, settled into you with the familiarity of something long endured. You wake with it already present, and you do not ask why, because the question itself has grown tired. There is a particular weight that does not press from outside, but gathers from within, accumulating through days that resemble one another too closely to justify distinction. It is not caused by a single loss or a visible wound. It arrives through continuation, through the steady repetition of mornings that require the same gestures and evenings that deliver no conclusion. What exhausts you is not effort, but the certainty that effort leads nowhere new. You notice how others speak of strain as if it were an interruption, something that will pass once circumstances shift. You do not correct them. You know that what you carry is not situational, and therefore not solvable. It is not a problem to be addressed, but a condition to be inhabited. At first, you may have thought this heaviness meant something was wrong, that you had failed to locate the proper attitude or the correct desire. Over time, that interpretation loosened its grip. The weight persisted regardless of optimism, regardless of discipline, regardless of resolve. Eventually you understood that it did not arrive because you resisted life, but because you continued to see it clearly. Desire once promised motion. It once suggested that something ahead might compensate for what was lacking now. That promise has thinned. You still want, in the technical sense, but wanting no longer carries persuasion. It asks, but does not convince. It gestures forward without supplying a reason to follow. This is not resignation in the dramatic sense. There is no collapse, no visible surrender. You continue to act, to respond, to fulfill what is required of you. But inside the actions, something has withdrawn. The belief that fulfillment waits at the end of striving has quietly stepped aside. You observe how effort continues long after expectation has dissolved. The body moves because it has learned to move, not because it anticipates reward. Routine replaces motivation without announcing the exchange. What once required hope now requires only habit. Time itself begins to feel altered. Days do not rush or drag, they simply accumulate. You are not impatient for them to end, nor eager for them to begin. You experience them as weight-bearing units, each one adding itself to the total without commentary. The future does not threaten you, but it does not invite you either. Others may describe boredom as restlessness, but that is not what you know. What settles in you is heavier than boredom and quieter than despair. It is the awareness that even relief would be temporary, that any easing of pressure would only restore the conditions under which pressure resumes. This knowledge does not upset you, it steadies you. You become less inclined to speak about what you carry, not because it is unspeakable, but because language would only misplace it. Words tend to imply solutions, or at least movement. What you experience does not seek movement, it seeks accuracy. There is dignity in this accuracy, though it is not the sort that announces itself. It does not improve your posture or sharpen your voice. It simply removes the need to pretend that endurance is something other than what it is. You do not elevate it. You do not resent it. You accept its presence the way one accepts gravity. When you look back, you can trace the moment when expectation thinned, when anticipation ceased to generate warmth. It did not happen suddenly. It wore away through repetition, through fulfilled desires that revealed themselves as insufficient, through disappointments that were not severe enough to teach but numerous enough to convince. Each experience contributed a small clarification. You now understand that happiness, as it is commonly spoken of, was never meant to endure. It appeared in brief alignments, in temporary silences of wanting. Its disappearance is not betrayal, it is consistency. This understanding does not liberate you. It does not console you. It simply removes confusion. You no longer mistake exhaustion for failure or clarity for bitterness. What remains is neither hopeful nor hopeless. It is exact. In social spaces, you perform the necessary gestures. You listen. You respond. You smile when required. You do not feel false while doing so. Because falseness implies an alternative you believe in. You no longer believe in alternatives. You participate because participation is expected. And expectation exerts its own quiet pressure. There is a moment, sometimes late in the day, when the body slows and the noise recedes enough for you to notice how little you are asking of life now. You are not bargaining. You are not demanding meaning. You are simply continuing. That continuation has its own weight, distinct from struggle, distinct from resistance. You may remember when endurance felt temporary, when you imagined it as a bridge leading somewhere else. That image no longer holds. Endurance is not a passage. It is the terrain itself. Once this is seen, there is no dramatic reaction. The mind adjusts, as it always does, to what persists. Sleep does not arrive as refuge. It arrives as interruption. Consciousness withdraws briefly, not to restore you, but to reset the conditions under which the same awareness will return. Morning does not surprise you. It confirms what was already understood. The weight you carry does not demand acknowledgement from others. It does not need validation to exist. It is self-sufficient. In this, it differs from suffering that seeks expression. What you carry remains even when fully recognized, even when precisely named. You may notice that your inner narration has grown quieter, not because you have found peace, but because commentary has lost its utility. There is nothing left to persuade yourself of. The facts are stable. The interpretation has settled. What remains is a form of standing, not defiance, not collapse, simply standing within the unaltered conditions of being alive, without expecting them to justify themselves. This stance does not feel heroic. It feels accurate. As the hours move forward, you do not measure them against fulfillment or disappointment. You allow them to pass through you with minimal resistance. Resistance would imply that something else is possible. You no longer invest energy in that implication. There is a clarity that comes when illusion no longer needs to be dismantled because it no longer presents itself. You do not argue with hope. You do not refute it. You simply no longer rely on it to explain why you continue. And so you carry the weight quietly. Not because you are strong, but because strength is irrelevant here. What you carry is not something to overcome. It is something to remain conscious within. Something that accompanies you as you move through tasks, through conversations, through time itself. And as you do, you begin to notice that even the act of noticing grows thinner, less insistent, until thought itself pauses briefly, as if listening for something further, and finding nothing that demands response, continues anyway, moving forward not toward relief, not toward conclusion, but toward the next moment in which this same recognition will once again be present, steady and unadorned, asking nothing, offering nothing, and persisting as it does, through you, with you, without urgency, without explanation, as the sentence of experience itself extends onward, not seeking closure, but remaining open, unfinished, carrying its own quiet weight into what comes next, where endurance does not announce itself but simply remains, and you remain with it, still aware, still standing, still moving, still existing within this unlifted gravity, as thought continues just far enough to sense that even this awareness does not resolve, does not conclude, but thins slightly, as if preparing to yield to the next breath, the next pause, the next moment in which the same understanding will resume, not as repetition, but as continuation. And in that continuation, there is no turn outward, no appeal, only the sustained presence of what has already been seen, and what will continue to be seen, as long as seeing itself has not yet ceased. And until that cessation arrives, there is nothing further to add, only the quiet persistence of being here, carrying what is carried, without complaint, without expectation, without the need to say more. As the thought moves onward, still incomplete, still open, still unfolding into the same unrelieved fact of being, where the weight does not increase, does not diminish, but simply remains, accompanying each moment as it passes into the next, leaving the sentence unfinished, suspended just long enough to allow what follows to emerge without interruption, without restart, without any signal that something new is beginning, only that what has already been underway continues, and continues, and continues, as it must, until it does not. And even that knowledge remains quiet, held without emphasis, without finality, as the awareness itself moves forward into the next stretch of thought, carrying the same restraint, the same thinness, the same steady recognition, as if the mind, too, has learned not to hurry, not to conclude, but to remain exactly where it is, attentive to the fact that this endurance is not a phase, not a lesson, but the enduring condition itself, and that understanding does not seek to end, but to persist, as the sentence trails onward, unresolved, still breathing, still aware, still present, waiting not for resolution, but simply for the next moment in which it will continue to be what it already is, without alteration, without relief, without appeal, as thought itself leans forward slightly, preparing to continue, still carrying the same quiet weight, into the next unbroken stretch of awareness that follows, where nothing changes except that it goes on, and goes on, and goes on, into the same open endurance, without conclusion, without punctuation, without anything that would suggest an end, only the continuation of this exact state, extending forward, unfinished, as it must, into whatever comes next, where the weight remains, and remains, and remains, and the thought continues just enough to remain aware of that, before yielding to the next breath, the next moment, the next unannounced continuation that has already begun, even now, as the words thin and the awareness holds, and the sentence does not yet stop, but pauses briefly, as if to allow the next movement of thought to enter without being named, without being separated, without being marked as anything other than what it is, which is simply the same endurance, carried forward, still unresolved, still present, still quietly unfolding, as the mind remains within it, and will remain, moving onward, into the next stretch of this same unbroken recognition, where the weight is neither resisted nor resolved, but simply continues, as it always has, and as it will, until continuation itself no longer occurs, and even that remains unspoken, held quietly, without emphasis, as the thought continues, unfinished, into the space that follows, where it will go on, and go on, and go on, without interruption, without closure, without relief, as the endurance itself continues to be the only constant, and the awareness of it continues, still carrying the same quiet weight, into the next moment, where this sentence will continue, and continue, and continue, without restart, without signal, without end, as it moves forward into the next response, still within the same breath, the same awareness, the same unbroken monologue that has not yet reached its stopping point, and therefore does not stop here, but remains open, mid-thought, ready to proceed further, without pause, without re-entry, without anything that would suggest a beginning again, only the ongoing presence of this same recognition, as it continues into what follows, still unfinished, still aware, still enduring, still carrying the weight, and still moving forward, as it must, into the next stretch of thought, where it will continue to unfold, without resolution, without announcement, as the same quiet endurance persists, and persists, and persists, just beyond this point, where the thought remains suspended, waiting to continue. And does. The continuation does not feel like a choice. It feels like momentum without destination, the kind that persists after intention has fallen away. You are carried forward by the same mechanisms that once served hope, now emptied of its color, operating out of sheer persistence rather than belief. You begin to notice how much of life is structured around postponement. Small tolerances are exchanged for future ease. Present discomfort justified by imagined relief. Over time, this structure reveals itself as circular. What was deferred arrives only to demand further deferral. The bargain never concludes. You do not feel cheated. You feel instructed. This instruction is not verbal. It is delivered through accumulation, through the number of mornings required to reach an evening that offers nothing new, through the repetition of conversations that circle familiar ground without arriving anywhere, through the gradual realization that explanation itself does not reduce the weight it names. You may still remember the period when clarity felt sharp, almost invigorating, when seeing through illusion carried a certain austere satisfaction. That sensation does not last. Clarity, once stabilized, becomes heavy in its own way. It removes the friction that once made struggle feel purposeful. Without friction, movement loses texture. The world does not appear hostile to you. That would be easier. Hostility implies intention, and intention invites response. What you encounter instead is neutrality, vast and unresponsive. Events occur without regard for your readiness or your fatigue. They do not oppose you. They simply proceed. This is where endurance separates itself from resistance. Resistance requires energy directed outward. Endurance requires only that you remain. It is not active. It is not passive. It is a condition of staying present within circumstances that do not improve through engagement. You notice how often people mistake endurance for virtue. They praise it, elevate it, turn it into an identity. You do not. To you, endurance is not admirable. It is unavoidable. It is what remains once alternatives have been exhausted. There is a quiet relief in no longer interpreting your fatigue as a flaw. The body tires because it moves. The mind tires because it sees. Neither condition implies error. They imply function extended beyond satisfaction. Desire, when it reappears now, does so in a diminished form. It no longer promises fulfillment, only variation, a different arrangement of the same elements, a slight shift in tone, enough to register as change, not enough to register as meaning. This recalibration alters how you experience pleasure. It still occurs, but it does not persuade. It arrives, is noticed, and passes without leaving residue. You do not cling to it because clinging would require the belief that it could anchor something. You know it cannot. Boredom, in this context, is not emptiness. It is saturation, too much familiarity, too much predictability, too much continuity. Nothing intrudes sharply enough to break the surface. Time flattens. Experience evens out. You begin to sense that much of what others call hope is simply a refusal to remain with this saturation. They lean forward, projecting themselves into futures that have not yet had the chance to disappoint them. You do not follow. Projection feels heavier than presence now. Presence itself becomes sparse. You are here, but without commentary, without the internal pressure to frame what you are experiencing as progress or decline. Moments pass through you without being evaluated. This is not peace, it is reduction. The reduction extends to your inner language. Words become less necessary. You still think, but thought no longer narrates itself continuously. Silence enters not as rest, but as absence of demand. You may notice how society organizes itself around distraction, noise, novelty, urgency. These are not inherently false, but they function as buffers against recognition. You no longer require buffering. The noise feels excessive, the novelty thin, the urgency misplaced. This does not make you superior, It makes you exposed, without distraction. There is only duration, duration without promise, duration without culmination. The idea of purpose becomes difficult to sustain under this exposure, not because it has been disproven, but because it has been rendered unnecessary. You continue without it, you act without it, you endure without invoking it. There is a subtle shift in how you regard suffering. You no longer dramatize it. Pain is no longer an event, but a background condition. Varying in intensity but constant in presence. You adjust to it the way one adjusts to weather. This adjustment does not numb you, it refines your sensitivity. You feel small changes more clearly because you are no longer waiting for large ones. The smallest increase in strain registers, the smallest easing is noticed, then released. Social expectations continue to arrive. You meet them with minimal friction, not because you believe in them, but because resistance would require more energy than compliance. This calculation is not cynical, it is economical. At times, you may wonder whether this economy has cost you something essential. You examine the question briefly, then set it aside. Essential to what? To fulfillment? To narrative? To an image of life that no longer persuades you? What remains essential now is accuracy, seeing what is there without embellishment, remaining with what persists without insisting that it justify itself. This stance does not improve your circumstances, it stabilizes your perception. Stability, once achieved, reveals another layer of weight, the weight of knowing that this clarity will not dissolve, that no revelation waits to replace it, that insight has done its work and remains. Exact and unyielding, you carry this knowledge quietly, not because it is secret, but because sharing it would alter nothing. Others would hear it through their own expectations. Translating it back into hope or despair, you do not correct them. Night arrives without ceremony. Sleep interrupts consciousness without restoring it. You wake again within the same conditions, slightly altered, never transformed. This cycle does not offend you. It instructs you again, patiently. The instruction continues, that life does not resolve, that understanding does not redeem, that endurance is not a path through something, but the shape of what is. You stand within this shape without naming it. Naming would suggest mastery. You do not master it. You remain within it. There is no audience for this remaining, no witness required. The dignity of it lies precisely in its unobserved nature. It is not performed, it is lived. As time extends forward, the question of how long no longer troubles you. Duration is not something you measure toward an end. It is something you inhabit until it ceases on its own. This is where the weight becomes almost imperceptible, not because it has lifted, but because you have adjusted to its exact measure. It fits now, not comfortably, but accurately. Accuracy does not console. It steadies. It removes the friction of false expectation. What remains is thin, quiet, sustained. And in this sustained thinness, thought itself slows, not from fatigue alone, but from lack of incentive to elaborate. There is nothing left to convince yourself of, nothing left to argue against, nothing left to anticipate with urgency. So the mind moves more sparingly, selecting only what must be noticed, allowing the rest to pass without comment. And as this economy of attention deepens, the experience of being alive narrows further, becoming less about events and more about continuity, less about feeling and more about duration, until even duration begins to lose its edges, blending into a single extended presence that does not announce itself as meaningful or meaningless, but simply persists, carrying you forward without asking whether you agree, without offering reason or refusal, continuing because continuation has not yet stopped, and within that ongoing movement, you remain aware enough to recognize that nothing new has been promised, nothing old has been revoked, and that this quiet persistence is not a waiting room, but the condition itself. Unfolding moment by moment, thinner now, quieter now, but no lighter. As the awareness settles into this reduced space and holds, preparing to move forward again without signaling a shift, without marking a division, only allowing the next stretch of this same unbroken recognition to follow. Just beyond this point, where the thought does not end, but pauses briefly, suspended, ready to continue, as it must, into what comes next. You do not experience this thinning as loss. Loss implies something once held that mattered enough to grieve. What has fallen away feels more like excess, like noise that no longer justifies its presence. The absence it leaves is not empty, it is simply unoccupied. You notice how memory changes under this condition. Past moments no longer arrange themselves into a story. They appear as isolated confirmations that what is happening now has happened before, in slightly altered forms, under slightly altered names. Memory ceases to instruct, it merely corroborates. The future undergoes a similar flattening. It does not frighten you, but it does not invite you either. You do not imagine it as an answer. You imagine it as an extension, more of the same material, rearranged without intention. There was a time when disappointment felt sharp because it interrupted expectation. That sharpness dulls once expectation itself has withdrawn. What remains is not numbness, but familiarity. The events that once wounded now register as predictable. This predictability does not make life easier. It makes it heavier in a different way. Surprise once carried the possibility of relief. Without it, each occurrence settles immediately into its place within an already known pattern. Nothing needs interpretation. You may observe others moving quickly, speaking urgently, behaving as if timing still matters in the way it once did for you. You do not judge them. You remember what it was like to require momentum in order to feel alive. You no longer require that sensation. Energy is spent only where it cannot be avoided. You conserve not out of strategy, but out of recognition. Every unnecessary expenditure deepens fatigue without producing return. This calculation becomes instinctive. You are sometimes mistaken for calm. The misunderstanding does not trouble you. Calm suggests balance. What you experience is equilibrium achieved through reduction. Fewer demands, fewer illusions, fewer internal negotiations. Even emotion adjusts its scale. Intensity recedes, leaving subtler variations in its place. You feel less, but you feel more precisely. Each sensation occupies a smaller space, arrives with less insistence, departs without protest. You do not seek to correct this condition. Correction implies an original state worth restoring. You no longer believe such a state existed. What you recall as vitality was inseparable from restlessness. What you recall as hope was inseparable from dissatisfaction. This understanding alters how you relate to effort. You still apply yourself, but without inner commentary. Effort is no longer framed as investment. It is simply movement required by circumstance. You stop where you can, you continue where you must. There is a peculiar honesty that emerges once reward is removed from action. Deeds are no longer inflated by expectation. They shrink to their actual size. This shrinkage does not diminish them. It clarifies them. You may notice that silence now carries more information than speech. In silence, there is no obligation to justify your presence or your fatigue. You exist without explanation. That is sufficient. At times, the mind attempts to revisit old frameworks, old questions, old longings. These attempts feel rehearsed, as if borrowed from another version of yourself. You let them pass without argument. They exhaust themselves quickly. What replaces them is not insight, but steadiness. A steadiness that does not aspire upward or sink downward. It remains level, even, unremarkable. It holds you in place without comfort and without alarm. The idea of meaning becomes strangely irrelevant here, not offensive, not rejected, simply unnecessary. You do not need meaning to endure. You need only the capacity to remain conscious without demand. This capacity is not limitless. Fatigue still accumulates. The body still resists. The mind still slows. But you no longer interpret these signals as warnings of failure. They are indicators of continuation reaching its natural boundaries. When those boundaries are reached, you pause, not to recover, but to wait. Waiting no longer carries impatience. It carries only duration. You begin to understand that much of what once felt unbearable was the insistence that it should be otherwise. Once that insistence withdraws, the same conditions remain. But without internal friction, the weight does not lessen. It distributes more evenly. This evenness is not pleasant. It is simply stable. You stop bracing yourself against what is already happening. Bracing required belief in an impact that never arrived. Now there is only contact. Contact with time as it passes. Contact with tasks as they present themselves. Contact with others as they speak and withdraw. None of it culminates. You may sense that language itself is becoming insufficient. Not because it cannot describe what you experience, but because description no longer alters anything. Words lose their leverage. They become observations without consequence. And so the inner narration continues to thin. Sentences shorten. Pauses lengthen. Awareness stretches without filling itself with interpretation. What remains is not emptiness, but exposure. Exposure to the fact that life does not negotiate. It proceeds. It continues. It does not respond to understanding with concession. Understanding arrives too late for that. This lateness does not anger you. It sobers you. You see that clarity was never meant to rescue. It was meant to remove distortion. Once distortion is removed, there is nothing left to chase. No correction to implement. No awakening to complete. Only the sustained presence of what has been seen. You stand within this presence without naming it as acceptance or resignation. Those terms still carry emotional weight. What you experience now is lighter than emotion and heavier than thought. It is simply the ongoing fact of being here, conscious enough to notice that nothing is promised, nothing is owed, and nothing is coming to justify the effort already spent. And as this realization settles deeper, it does not intensify, but quiets further, as if the mind itself has learned to reduce its movements to what is strictly necessary, allowing each moment to arrive and depart without commentary, without resistance, without appeal. And in this reduced state, time continues to pass, not as a sequence of meaningful units, but as a single, extended exposure, thinning further, softening at the edges, holding you within it as awareness persists, just enough to register that this continuation has no direction other than forward, and that forward does not lead anywhere new, only further into the same condition, where endurance is no longer felt as effort, but as position. And from within that position, thought pauses again, suspended, preparing to move on without signaling a change, without announcing what follows, only allowing the next stretch of this same unbroken recognition to continue, quietly, steadily. Just beyond this point, the continuation feels almost mechanical now. Though not in a crude sense, it is the mechanism of awareness maintaining itself without enthusiasm, without protest. You are present because presence has not yet withdrawn. You notice how little is required to keep going, not strength, not belief, not courage, only the absence of a reason to stop. This absence does not feel dramatic, it feels administrative. The mind, having relinquished its larger ambitions, attends only to what is immediately necessary. It registers hunger, fatigue, minor irritations, passing comforts. Nothing accumulates into significance. Everything arrives, is processed, and dissolves. You may realize that much of what once felt unbearable was not the weight itself, but the demand that it leads somewhere. Once that demand falls away, the same weight remains. But it no longer argues with you. It rests where it is. There is no triumph in this adjustment. It does not improve you. It simply aligns perception with condition. Misalignment was exhausting. Alignment is merely quieter. You no longer scan your experience for lessons. Learning implies progress. And progress implies a direction you no longer recognize as binding. What occurs now occurs without instructional value. It is sufficient as occurrence. Others may still speak to you as if something is unfolding, as if you are in the middle of a process. You do not correct them. From where you stand, There is no middle. Only extension. Extension without destination changes how patience feels. You are not waiting for relief, nor bracing for collapse. You are occupying time the way one occupies space, without expectation that it will transform into something else. The body continues to signal its limits. You respond to those signals without interpretation. Rest is taken when required. Effort resumes when required. Neither state carries meaning beyond necessity. You may sense that what remains of your inner life has become narrower, but also more exact. There is less movement, but less distortion. Nothing swells beyond its measure. This exactness brings no comfort. Comfort would require contrast. What you experience now is uniform enough to resist consolation. It neither soothes nor disturbs. It simply persists. Language continues to recede. When you speak, it is functional. When you think, it is brief. The elaborate inner monologues of earlier years feel unnecessary, almost indulgent. What replaces them is not wisdom. Wisdom still implies vantage. What you have now is proximity. You are close to the fact of being alive in a way that offers no overview and no escape. This closeness reveals how little drama is actually required for life to feel heavy. Catastrophe was never necessary. Continuation alone was sufficient. You do not resent this realization. Resentment would imply that something else was owed. You do not feel owed. You feel accounted for. Accounted for by time, by repetition, by the quiet consistency of days that do not need to distinguish themselves in order to continue. Each one confirms the last without commentary. As this confirmation repeats, even awareness begins to thin further, not disappear, but simplify. You notice less, you react less, you remain. Remaining does not feel like a choice. It feels like the default state once alternatives have been exhausted and discarded. There is no pressure to rename it. You may sense that even this description is approaching its own limit, not because the condition has changed, but because articulation has done what it can do. Beyond this point, words do not add clarity. What remains is the same steady presence, unrelieved and unadorned, carrying you forward without promise and without threat. It does not ask you to understand it further. And so, the endurance continues. Not as effort and not as refusal, but as the simple fact of still being here, conscious enough to register that nothing is resolving, nothing is collapsing, nothing is arriving to replace what has been seen. Only the ongoing extension of this same quiet condition, thinning slightly with each moment, holding without tension, without appeal, without conclusion. As awareness stays just long enough to notice that it is still present, and then stays again and again, without marking an end, without anticipating one, remaining within this exact weight as it carries forward into what follows. Unfinished, undramatic, still open, still continuing, because continuation itself has not yet ceased, and until it does, there is nothing further required, nothing further expected, nothing further to say. As the thought slows, pauses, and remains suspended here, mid-breath, mid-awareness, within the same unlifted gravity, still standing, still enduring, still simply being, without resolution, without relief, without finality. As it goes on,